Welcome to the Future Knowledge Podcast and our special summer series on vanishing culture, brought to you by me, Vida, and the Internet Archive. We're talking with the archivists, librarians, and creators fighting to preserve our shared cultural history.
Hey listeners, I'm Dave Hansen.
And I'm Chris Freeland. This is Future Knowledge.
A note as we start up. We're sharing a special 6-part weekly series called Vanishing Culture, exploring what's at risk of being lost in the digital age and why preservation matters.
The series is inspired by Vanishing Culture, the new book from the Internet Archive. You can read it online for free at archive.org or find it in print at your favorite bookstore.
And now, on with today's episode.
Today, we're headed to the Caribbean island of Aruba to talk about the importance and the challenges of preserving Creole languages. How does culture vanish in colonial contexts? And how can digitization help? I'm Vida, a musician and an artist. In this podcast series, I'll be finding out more about public access to culture and how to preserve it for future generations. Join me as I learn from the experts about threats to preservation in the digital age and what happens when culture vanishes. This week, we're talking to Peter Scholing, a researcher and advisor at Biblioteca Nacional Aruba and manager of the digital heritage platform Colección Aruba. We sat down with Peter and asked him about the work he's doing to preserve Aruba's cultural and linguistic heritage. What is the Colección Aruba, and how did it come about?
Well, a national library has existed since 1949. So since that time, the public library of the island government of Aruba, because Aruba was part of, at first, the colony of Curaçao, part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And afterwards, the colony became a separate country within the kingdom, the Netherlands Antilles. And in 1986, Aruba became a separate country, still within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So there's still colonial and former colonial ties going on. But since becoming a country in 1986, Aruba's library actually became the national library. We started digitizing quite early on. We started preserving digital copies of the newspapers that were otherwise thrown out maybe or deleted. But it wasn't until 2018 when we had a surprise visitor, a tourist, and she happened to work at the Internet Archive. And I was explaining that with limited resources, with limited maybe funding as well, being an island library, we don't really have the resources that the big institutions, the universities, the national libraries or archives in bigger countries have. So that means that while we have a lot of unique information, and through the diaspora, a lot of our people from Aruba, from the islands, don't really live on Aruba anymore. It remains our largest audience, but there's a lot of Arubans and people from the former Netherlands Antilles that live in the Netherlands. They live in the US. And for people the next island over, it's not really easy to visit. Like, it's easy to visit. It only takes like half an hour to fly here, but it's really expensive. So if you are doing your research, it might be really costly just to fly over and have the chance that something isn't there, isn't accessible, or maybe it's a holiday, or you want to access your information 24/7. Well, all these things can, in theory, be mitigated by putting your stuff online, but exactly that is the biggest barrier for most islands and small-scale institutions. But while talking about that with Stacy, she said, well, why don't you try uploading stuff to the Internet Archive as just a regular user and see what happens? So that started in 2018 with just a few uploads to test things. In March of 2019, we launched our National Library collection, which only had like 300 digital items at that point. But it was just at the right time, I think. The pandemic happened. We couldn't see that Well, it's hard to predict things like that, right? But what happened was that all the libraries, the schools were closed, the libraries were closed. Urban students living in the Netherlands couldn't even go to their university or to their university library, but they still had classes. They still had the need to access information. In Aruba, that was just around the time for the preparations of the high school exams. Well, Papiamento had been an official language in Aruba for a couple of decades already, but it has been quite recent that it was introduced as a separate subject in high schools. So at that point, just around the pandemic, it was like the first wave of students, high school students, having to do their exams in the Papiamento subject. And for that, access to books is needed, access to source materials is needed. So during the pandemic, we had some small portable scanners we took home. We scanned books. We talked to the authors because they're also, with a small scale society, it's easy to contact the authors as well. So we asked for their permission. We put the books available online for digital collection through the Internet archives. And those students were able to do their exams, read the books. We contacted the newspaper publishers. We had already been saving their digital-born originals, the newspapers they made, and they couldn't be printed during the pandemic, but we put them online, and we put the old issues online as well. And that were the ones that people used regularly to visit the library for, just to investigate them. And now everybody was online 24/7. Nobody had, well, everybody was limited to their own house, to the grounds of their property, but they still had some access to the digital information. So there was a big need for getting not just access to the world news, to things that were happening, but also the local things that were happening. So we played a role in that, and we saw that after the pandemic ended, there's still a big need for access to that information. What we did at that point was try and connect with our other partners on the island. Well, we had long-standing collaboration with the National Archives already. They already also had been digitizing. But yeah, after the pandemic, we thought, well, the best thing we can do to preserve our information and to have people access it is not just by still expecting after the pandemic and after everything went online that people should just only be dependent on going to our physical buildings and having access to everything. So in 2022, we started something called Collection Aruba, the Aruba collection, which was a natural continuation of what we had already been doing with the National Library, but also building upon the work at the National Archives and other places. And yeah, we started the Aruba collection in 2022. And now we have almost 180,000 digital items. And we only have 110,000 inhabitants.
I was interested in how Aruba's colonial context and its island geography relate to vanishing culture. What are the challenges of preserving culture in these contexts? And why is it particularly important?
We are doing a lot of digitizing here at the National Library and basically in Aruba in general. And we try to not only do that because of preservation for next generations or in case of emergencies, hurricanes, rising sea levels, temperature that is global warming, things like that, but also to make it accessible. We're on an island, so that means that there's a natural barrier to accessing our information. There has been historically, and that's one of the things we try to mitigate. We have a lot of, and we started in 2019 with like 300 items, right? So it's been growing quite a bit. We have a lot of local partners, but we're also aware through our history and our colonial relations with Europe, with the Netherlands, that a lot of our information is not just on the island here. It's scattered all around. We even have a part of our history that's in the US, in Austin, Texas. A lot of islands have had or still have refineries operating. They're foreign owned. The oil comes from Venezuela. But yeah, the influence of those refineries, those foreign companies on our economy has been really big. It's had a real big impact. But when they stop, a lot of the archives, a lot of the materials go back to the original where the owners are from. So that's why a lot of our history is not in Aruba, but it's in Austin, Texas. It's in The Hague in the Netherlands. And even in Curacao, we were a part of the Netherlands Antilles. Well, the capital was not on Aruba, it was on the next island over in Curacao. So that means that a lot of our records are there. A lot of our church records historically were being kept in Caracas in Venezuela, in Coro in Venezuela, because the Catholic, Aruba is a really Catholic island. The Catholic population is, well, it's a large part of our population, but compared to bigger islands, compared to bigger countries where the population isn't really that big. So historically, the bishops and the church administration, everything was centered around Venezuela at that time. So we have a lot of our historical records that are relatively inaccessible right now. We're trying to think of ways to create partnerships for us to get access to those documents as well, start projects maybe in the future, make sure those archives are also being digitized, and hopefully they'll become available through our Aruba collection. All our colonial history had been recorded in Dutch. And like I said, well, it's being taught in schools, it's an instruction language, but nobody really uses it. That meant in the past that if you want to research your history, then you get a language barrier on your own island because it was written in Dutch. Not even mentioning it that it was previously held in the National Archives in The Hague, for instance, and that it was a geographical limitation as well to access those things. But now, through digitization, those colonial records have been made available. They've been handwritten texts recognized, HDR'd, and you can search for it, but you still have to speak Dutch or read Dutch to figure out what they're talking about. But because there's now also a text layer in Dutch for those handwritten text documents, you can also translate it to Papiamento or to Spanish or to any other language. And that may help people locally to understand their historical documents, although they were written in a completely different language. But it also may help researchers from Venezuela, for instance, trying to read correspondence in Dutch about the region, about Venezuela and Aruba and trade and things like that. But now they can read it in Spanish as well. So that helps unlock a lot of the information that was previously just held in an archival document. Being handwritten was difficult, hard to read, hard to understand because it's in a different language now. And also because it's locked in an archive in an island or in Europe, for instance, well, it's hard to access it. Well, we've tried to remove all those different barriers that existed. It's still not perfect, but still anybody anywhere can now access these kinds of documents, this information, wherever they are, which language they speak doesn't, well, it does matter, but not as much as it did. And that hopefully it's a step towards universal access to our information and hopefully also a better research and understanding of everything that we think is important here on Aruba, but maybe it's now open for the world to discover as well. And the interesting thing is we've also received requests from like regional or local institutions in really big countries that have faced the same problems. If you're like a local museum or a regional, like a historical society, yeah, you don't have the funding and the manpower either. And a solution like we thought of being, and also assisted by the Internet Archive, that may be really helpful for historical societies in bigger countries as well. It doesn't really necessarily have to be applied to just the island's context. It's helpful for us in an island context, and it may be helpful for a lot of other islands in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, anywhere, but it might be relevant. Aruba model and the way we solved certain things can be relevant in many, many different contexts, I think.
I was interested to learn more about Papiamento. I asked Peter to give me a bit of a background about Aruba's languages.
So, Papiamento is our official language, Aruba, and the other ABC islands, which are Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, are part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And we have, not always, since colonial times, we've had Dutch as our official language. So it was the official language of legislation, of governments, of schools, but not necessarily, actually, not even of people speaking it to each other. At some point in colonial times, it was perhaps different between administrators and officials, but Papiamento has been the language spoken on the islands for centuries. It is a Creole language, so it means that it was created. It is a blend at some point. It's created sounds a bit artificial, but it came to exist because was an influx of many people from many countries through trade, through slavery as well, through colonial ties, economical ties also within the region. So it's a Creole language that has influences from Portuguese, from Spanish, from Dutch, from English even, but also from native Indian, Arawak influences, but also African influences. It was like the lingua franca of the islands. Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao aren't really that big. So if you look at a world stage, it's a minority language, but it's a really unique language and it's alive and it's now, apart from Dutch, it's officially become one of the official languages and it's being introduced in education. It's a gradual process and it will take a long time, but still it's being spoken, it's active, and it's a really interesting language. And if you speak Portuguese, you can understand quite a bit of it.
I asked Peter to tell me more about the work he's doing to digitize materials in Papiamento. Why is it important to preserve the language, particularly as a Creole in a colonial context?
Well, before the pandemic, I did an interview with a local newspaper, and the headline that they chose was, "If you're not visible online, then you don't exist." Well, that's a bit harsh, I guess, but in today's world, it's if you go on the internet, if what you see is just majority languages and the things that are not about your own context, about your local context, about your island's context, or even your culture, then, well, it's about representation, right? Or lack of representation. And I think up to a few years ago, our national language, Papiamento, was not really represented that well online. If you link it to education, to this point, the majority of the textbooks, etc., are in Dutch, imported in many cases from the Netherlands, not in all cases. We have a really good language department and curriculum department at the Department of Education that is producing local materials and localized materials, and also in Papiamento. But if you go to school here on the islands and you have to learn everything in a language that isn't really spoken. And especially, for instance, if you're doing geography, if you have to learn about Dutch or European geology, geography, etc., before you learn about your own culture and context, how does that help you? How does that make school or learning interesting? Because it's about somebody else. It's not in your language, and it's about trains and about snow and about people going into the mountains. It's interesting, but if you're getting an education, then it should at least be relevant to you. And there's a big discussion about the instruction language here on the island, and in many colonial or post-colonial societies it is. But in our case, one of the argumentations, one of the things used for reasoning education should continue in Dutch, for instance, or only in Dutch, was that there weren't any materials available locally. There wasn't enough local history, literature, etc. being produced, or maybe it wasn't available to the people developing the materials. If you look at it from that way, now with Aruba collection hosted by the Internet Archive with 180,000 items in it, tens of thousands of text in Papiamento, totaling millions of pages by now, over 100,000 pictures, recent pictures, but also historical pictures, and a lot of audio and video materials being available, I think that argumentation doesn't hold anymore. It's still too small a market to develop material specifically for Aruba or for the ABC Islands. Yeah, that's economics is another part of it. But I think as a national library, as a digital collection consortium, Collection Aruba, I think we are providing that information about our local context, about our country, about Aruba and the wider Caribbean in such a way that it's hard to keep up that argumentation that there's not enough materials available. I think we even have like an avalanche effect going on as well. We see that by putting our materials online, people use it more, people write their dissertations, their theses, their research about using that information. So that means that there's a lot of creation and inspiration going on at the moment as well. So there's like an acceleration of interests on Aruban context about Papiamento going on. And hopefully that will shape further research, further discourse, further discussion on the importance of our language, about preserving it and making it something, keeping up that it's a vivid, it's a culture and it's a language that is very much alive, and that there's a really big importance of making sure that those expressions, those new expressions are also being captured, shared, and made available as well. I think, there's a lot of forces going on. But I think our digital preservation and access effort is one of the catalysts of that movement that's going on at the moment.
I asked Peter about his hopes for the future of Papiamento. How can we preserve smaller languages in the digital age and improve language diversity online?
What we saw is that if you look at it from like a technical or cultural standpoint, if you look at the internet and the world as like a global market, the large languages dominate. So that means that for many countries, for dozens of languages, things like Google Translate or support for your language in your phone or in like a website or a computer program that you use has been really obvious. Maybe YouTube already has automatic captioning and translation for many languages. Well, for Papiamento, that was not the case because it wasn't really commercially viable and there wasn't anything available digitally to train those technologies on. And in the last couple of years, we've seen that that has changed. ChatGTP, if you ask it a question in Papiamento, you'll get an answer in Papiamento. It's a strange mix, a really imperfect mix of Papiamento and Papiamento, but it's understandable. Just last year, Google introduced Google Translate in Papiamento. It's not that good, but still it's something. We have so many, with hours and hours, hundreds of hours of digitized video and audio reels, for instance, that we've been trying and we've been dying to have that transcribed, for instance. Well, that technology doesn't exist and no big company is going to develop it for us probably. So what we have to do is do it ourselves. And I think that's how one of the effects we've been seeing recently is that, and that's the younger generation, there's a surge in interest for cultural topics, local cultural topics, but also for language topics. So that means that like the 21st century generation that has gotten an education, they were born around the same time that Papiamento became an official language. So they've seen it being more present and now they want to do something with it. And we've been getting a lot of requests recently to provide data or to collaborate or even be present at graduations at the university. That there are kids now graduating from college researching topics like how can you train AI to use Papiamento. And maybe the next step will be that spoken word to text translation, that the thing that we're waiting for our automatic subtitling, or making audio and video searchable. I think in the next few years, we'll see a lot of those technological advances being available as well for Pacimento. And those technology advances will be driven by Aruban and Curacao and young adults developing that technology because they need it, they want it to exist, and it doesn't exist yet. So there's a new generation driving that change, and we play a small part in that just by making sure there's a lot of information available. And that can be just for one individual learning about an island that person hasn't visited, or that can be for somebody in school having to write a paper or having to do a presentation on a local topic that usually in the past we had to say, maybe you have to look at those years and those newspapers to find that information, but nobody has written about it. Well, now people are writing about it. It's easier to get to those snippets of information. And yeah, it creates more value, more context, not just in Pacimento, but also for our island, for our nation as a whole as well. So there's a lot of interesting developments going on. And I'm glad that we as Aruba Collection are a part of it, but people are using our information to create new stuff and to provide us with new services. And we can benefit from that as well. We can implement those technologies in our workflows, in our interfaces, have a more multilingual approach to our collections as well. So that's really exciting, I think.
Speaking with Peter made me reflect on how it is possible to trace geographical and political histories through the ways in which language develops. It's clear that the dominance of the major languages, many of which are colonial, affects the preservation and accessibility of smaller languages online. It is efforts such as Colección Aruba that change the status quo. Perhaps what Peter mentioned about how not being on the internet means not existing is something worth thinking about in our current digital era. Join us next time for a wrap-up episode with Chris Freeland and Dave Hansen of the Future Knowledge podcast.